Everything began in a quiet room, and there, sunken into a beanbag chair in the corner of the room, was our hero. As he calmly leafed through the pages of a book, he murmured to himself that place, silent and cozy, was the literature club. And while the club, in truth, didn't develop any real activity, our hero was the only member of the club. For that reason, that place served more as a quiet hideout where one could be alone after classes. That was his supreme private space. That place was his sacred ground within the school. Suddenly, the door of the club room slowly opened. Surprised by the unexpected noise, our protagonist quickly turned his head. A girl, dressed in sports clothes, was the one entering the poor guy's sacred ground. With wide eyes, the girl showed surprise upon finding someone in the room. She then hesitated at the entrance. The young man, confused by the sudden appearance, wondered who she could be, but observing her better, he remembered her. Then, the girl advanced towards him, and suddenly, to his complete astonishment, she bowed right in front of him. With a flushed face and wide eyes, he tried to get her attention. Repeatedly, he tried to call her. The girl then straightened up, stopping in a fetal position behind him. Confused, the young man asked what she was doing there. At that instant, another girl appeared at the door. The little blonde stared at him and asked if a girl from the athletics had entered there. Quickly, the first girl hidden behind him asked him not to reveal her presence. Shortly after, our hero replied that he hadn't seen anyone, and the girl, suspicious, said she understood, muttering she mentioned it was a shame as the tournament was approaching. The door then closed with a bang, leaving the two alone again in the club room. Relieved, the first girl stood up, stretching. With a smile and a thumbs up, she thanked the young man for the help. Still a bit dazed by the situation, he just murmured an okay. The girl then started complaining, saying she couldn't stand the athletics club anymore and that their Spartan teaching methods were very outdated. At that moment, she spotted the manga he was holding, an issue of that week's Shonen Jump, and excitedly asked if she could take a look, and he, a bit surprised, let her. With the manga in hand, she settled on the floor, starting to leaf through it with a smile. Meanwhile, the young man observed her, remembering who she was, Natsuki Shiho. She was the star of the school's athletics team. With her cheerful personality and who made no distinction between people, she was quite popular among the boys, especially those in her grade. However, he saw himself as her complete opposite, someone who usually stayed in the corner during lunch with his group, talking about games. Definitely, she was his extreme opposite. He reflected that naturally they had no point of contact since they attended different classes, and because of that, that was the first time he saw her so up close. Our protagonist couldn't help but notice her immense melons and her defined abdomen, a result of her intense training. And as she laughed loudly with the book, the poor guy claimed it was strange to see her there in her gym uniform, something that clashed with the room's atmosphere. Trying to break the ice, she called him. Then she asked if that was the literature club and if he was alone, and he confirmed, explaining that as she could see, there was no one else there, that being his private space. Then she stopped for an instant. With a smile, she commented that the place looked like a secret hideout and asked if he didn't feel the same, to which the young man, a bit awkwardly, just agreed timidly. At the same instant, she laughed, stating that she had found a fantastic place to relax, which left our hero confused. Suddenly, his eyes widened with what he had just heard. Incredulous, he asked if he had understood correctly that she intended to come back there other times, and she confirmed, questioning if there would be any problem with that. In thought, he immediately protested, saying that was unthinkable after all. That place was his sacred ground, and just imagining someone else taking that space already bothered him, and stated that he would not allow intruders in his refuge. Soon, she commented that he must be in a difficult situation to react that way so suddenly, stating it must be quite an inconvenience for someone to disrupt his club like that, especially showing up there all sweaty after training. Soon, she apologized for being smelly, while he, completely flushed, vehemently denied having said anything of the sort. Then, she turned away, telling him not to worry, as she wouldn't come back to the club anymore. The young man became visibly distressed by the situation, and as she headed towards the door, he, flustered and yielding to pressure, ended up saying it was fine if she wanted to come back. Upon hearing that, she turned around animatedly, and with her eyes shining with surprise, she asked if he was serious. The young man, still a bit confused by his own decision, saw Natsuki thank him with enthusiasm. Internally, he lamented, realizing that in the flow of conversation, he had accidentally given her permission to come back. With a smile, she asked what his name was, and he, still a bit hesitant, replied that his name was Tamaya. With that, Natsuki, with a radiant smile, introduced herself and said it was a pleasure to meet him, and bidding farewell with a wave, she stated she would see him the next day. The door then closed, leaving our hero alone in the room again. With a sigh, he began to wonder what had just happened. Then, reality struck him. She would really come back the next day. Suddenly, he stood up filled with regret, and now thought that the best thing to do would be to push her away from his sacred space. And true to her word, the next day, Natsuki appeared at the club door, greeting him. Tamiya, who was quietly reading at his desk, looked up and could only stammer, while in his mind he exclaimed that she had really appeared, and labeled her as the lioness, the one who threatened his sacred territory. Soon, he wondered how he could make her leave. Natsuki then sat on the floor asking what he was doing, and our hero replied that he was studying. She then commented that the exams were approaching. At that moment, an idea emerged in Tamiya's mind. He confirmed with a nod and soon seized the opportunity to vent, admitting that he had a lot of difficulty with math and that it always left him frustrated. Soon, he said he would have problems if he couldn't concentrate. With a sly smile, he believed his strategy would work, making her feel guilty and end up giving up on bothering him. With that, the smart guy already started celebrating internally the success of his perfect plan. However, to his surprise, Natsuki stood up and walked towards him, and then she leaned over his desk. Shocked, Tamiya realized that instead of leaving, she was getting even closer. She then called him and then offered to teach him, leaving him completely stunned. Confidently, the girl stated that despite her appearance, she was great at math. Our protagonist tried to refuse, saying he didn't want to bother, but she soon retorted that she didn't mind, while inside he was panicking, because in truth, the one who minded was him, and a lot. Her approach made him visibly nervous. Desperate, he stammered, trying to fix the situation, saying he wasn't that bad at math, leaving Natsuki confused, not understanding if he wanted help or was just running away from her. Soon, Tamiya could only lament internally the failure of his plan. Then, a sigh escaped him. While the two remained silent for a moment, Natsuki let out a yawn and stretched. And, to his astonishment, she simply lay down on the floor. Our hero, flushed, stated that she had a lot of courage to lie down like that, exposing her armpits, and wondered if she didn't realize they were in the same environment. A light snore escaped her lips, and in a short time, she fell deeply asleep. Tamiya couldn't believe how bold she was, but deciding to ignore her, he turned his attention back to his studies. However, his gaze, now and then, would stray to the sleeping girl beside him. First, he observed her armpit. With that, his face flushed while his eyes widened at the privileged view, and then he was attracted to her full breasts, which rose and fell gently with her breathing. He then fought against the temptation, reprimanding himself mentally not to get carried away by the distraction. Soon, he returned to concentrating on his studies, but his red pen failed. It was then that he remembered he had bought an extra refill and stored it in his backpack. Upon looking for his backpack, he found it right next to the girl. A feeling of discomfort invaded him as he realized it would be difficult to get the pen without waking her up. He then wondered if he should leave it for later, but quickly changed his mind, questioning why he needed to act with so much care, since after all, that room was still his. Then, he decided he wouldn't mind her and would get his pen as quickly as possible, and with great care, he stretched out his arm towards the backpack. However, upon trying to open the zipper, his hand slipped, and he lost his balance, making the poor guy yell as he fell. Then, he ended up falling right on Natsuki's large melons. His arms sank into her soft breasts, and his heart raced with the unexpected contact. Soon, a cold sweat ran down his forehead while panic took over. Natsuki then stirred, muttering something indecipherable while Tamiya, terrified, jumped back. As she rubbed her eyes, sleepy, he tried to explain himself, stammering that it wasn't what she was thinking at all, stating that he was just trying to get his backpack. Suddenly, Natsuki stood up quickly, surprised to have fallen asleep. Right after, she said she needed to go back to her club and left in a hurry. After that, our hero started looking at his trembling hand. His face still remained flushed. Relieved, he concluded that at least she didn't seem to have interpreted the situation wrongly, which took a weight off his shoulders. But suddenly, stopped in the hallway, Natsuki, completely flushed, wondered if he had just groped her. Later, back in the club room, Tamiya remained alone, lost in his thoughts while drinking something. Then, he started to remember what had happened in that room. Even with the passing of time, he could still feel the sensation of that moment, and started to remember the softness of her breasts, which made him flushed. Shaking his head, he wondered why he was feeling so attracted to her, and while drinking, he tried to push away the bothersome thoughts that insisted on appearing, like a devil trying to disturb him. Suddenly, a voice interrupted him, asking what devil he was referring to, and to his surprise, it was Natsuki who appeared beside him. Startled, he yelled, asking when she had arrived there, and she, with a smile, replied it hadn't been long. Natsuki then questioned him about what he was thinking, and Tamiya stammered that it wasn't a big deal. Curious, she approached, saying she had a favor to ask him, and suspicious, he asked what it was about. Then, the girl asked if she could use his refrigerator. Then, she pointed to the small mini fridge in the corner of the room. Natsuki explained it would be very convenient to be able to keep her drink cold there, because if she left it outside, it would warm up quickly. Internally, our hero panicked, thinking she was very cheeky for trying to take over even his refrigerator, and he swore to himself that he wouldn't let her do whatever she pleased anymore. But to his surprise, she said she wouldn't ask to use it for free, and with a smile, Natsuki offered him to ask for whatever he wanted in return. Tamiya was completely stunned by the proposal. His eyes widened at the possibilities. The word anything echoed in his mind, and as she sat down in an inviting manner, our protagonist's eyes seemed to be drawn to her breasts. Noticing his expression, Natsuki asked with a certain naturalness if he wanted to grope them, and sighed, saying saying that if that were the case, she didn't mind. Suddenly, a cold sweat ran down Tamiya's face, completely shocked by the unexpected offer. With his face completely red and his hand trembling, he extended his arm towards her, and so he began to grope Natsuki's melons while she closed her eyes. A smile formed on her face, but it was all just his imagination. Tamiya covered his face with his hand, clearly embarrassed by his own thoughts. He lowered his head, questioning himself internally about what the devil he was thinking. Then, he finally gave in, saying it was just a refrigerator and that she could use it whenever she wanted, which left Natsuki surprised, asking if he was serious. And with a smile, she thanked him and placed her bottle in the refrigerator. Bidding farewell, Natsuki left the room skipping, leaving Tamiya behind, still a bit dazed by the situation. Moments later, the poor guy opened a can of drink, grumbling to himself that he had been taken advantage of by her again. Soon, he threw himself onto the beanbag chair, and a heavy sigh escaped his lips. Trying to compose himself, he stood up and walked towards a vending machine in the hallway. Standing in front of the machine, he thought to himself that he needed to calm down. He then pressed one of the buttons, and while drinking an Estes flask, Tamiya tried to convince himself that breasts were just heaps of fat, stating that he also had his own. And walking back, he stated to himself that if he thought that way, her melons wouldn't be a big deal. Upon entering the club room again, he felt calmer and more relaxed. He then headed to the mini fridge and opened it. The next day, after classes, our protagonist found himself again in his private refuge, the literature club room, and as usual, Natsuki entered the room, exclaiming that she was exhausted. She then walked towards the mini fridge, stating it was time to hydrate. Upon opening the refrigerator, she came across 2 identical bottles of her drink. Soon, the girl called our hero, making him turn around against his will. With the 2 bottles in hand, she commented that there were 2 identical drinks there, and then she questioned him about which one would be his. At the same instant, his eyes widened in pure panic, and he exclaimed, surprised that the drinks were identical. Internally, he cursed himself for not having realized he had bought the same drink as her. He entered into despair, thinking he had just grabbed what he wanted without thinking, and that now she would certainly consider him a pervert for having bought the same drink on purpose. While Natsuki tried to remember which side she had placed her bottle on, the poor guy wondered how much of the drink he had already drunk. Sweat ran down his face. Then, thinking he needed to redeem himself, he decided to buy another drink to compensate, and while trying to explain, started to stammer her name. But before he could say anything, Natsuki grabbed one of the bottles and started drinking. She then stopped, wondering what kind of reaction his was. Tamiya, completely terrified, stammered asking whose bottle that would be, and the girl, unconcerned, replied she had no idea. With a smile, she stated that since the content was the same, it didn't matter whose bottle it was. Then, she continued drinking quietly. Sometime later, Natsuki was sitting on the floor, reading, completely at ease in the club room. She seemed so natural there that it was as if she had always been part of the environment. Our hero, sitting on the beanbag chair, observed her, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. Then, getting up, he called the girl up and asked if she wouldn't like to sit on the beanbag chair, commenting that it must be uncomfortable to stay on the floor. With a smile, Natsuki thanked him for his concern, but assured him that she was totally fine. The young man, however, became even more uncomfortable with that. He questioned himself why he was being so attentive to her, reminding himself that Natsuki was Target N, the person he needed to get out of there as soon as possible. However, he also admitted to himself that he felt bad for being alone in the comfort of the beanbag chair while she stayed on the floor, especially when they were alone in the room. The next day, the sound of the club door opened once more, and Natsuki entered with a greeting as always. Our hero, who was now sitting on the floor leaning against the wall, just greeted her back. She stared at him, confused as to why he was sitting on the floor, and walked around the room, looking from one side to the other, trying to see where she would sit. He then thought to himself that if he left the beanbag chair empty, she would naturally sit on it. Although a bit dissatisfied with the change, Tamiya, in turn, thought he wouldn't mind if it helped him relax. But to the young man's complete astonishment, she knelt beside him on the floor. Desperate, he stated that he had given up the beanbag chair for her and yelled internally for her to just sit there. He begged her not to sit beside him, fearing that the heat, pressure, and overwhelming sensation of her breasts would crush him. And stammering, he asked if Natsuki didn't want to use the beanbag chair. The girl, however, replied that she was fine and suggested that he use it himself. Then there arose in Tamiya's mind a sudden and terrible suspicion. Soon the poor guy wondered if the beanbag chair was smelly, and if the reason she didn't want to sit there was because he, from using it so much, no longer noticed that the seat was smelly. Decided to solve the problem, he grabbed a bottle of pest control. Then Tamiya started spraying the product onto the beanbag chair. Proudly, he presented the now perfumed and shiny beanbag chair. But Natsuki showed no reaction, and instinctively, she smelled her own armpit. With a flushed face and wide eyes, she asked, stammering, by chance she was smelly. Our hero hero then tried to explain himself, saying he had thought she didn't want to sit on the sofa because it was smelly. However, still with a degree of uncertainty, she continued smelling her own blouse. The young man was left without a reaction for a moment, and soon looked away. The next day, once again, the club door opened with a creak, and Natsuki entered animatedly. Tamiya, who this time was sitting on the beanbag chair, greeted her back. The girl then stopped in the middle of the room, looking at him, and as she walked around the room, Natsuki seemed to notice something on the floor. It was a new cushion. Tamiya, still immersed in his book, just gestured for her to use the cushion and explained that since he had just bought it, it should be clean. Natsuki showed surprise upon realizing he had bought something for her. Promptly, the girl offered to pay for the cushion, but Tamiya quickly gestured, saying it was fine and that she could consider it a gift. Soon, she calmed down. He then waved his hand and told her not to worry, as it had been something really cheap. Suddenly, to his surprise, Natsuki grabbed his hand. With a smile, she looked at him, and then she thanked him with enthusiasm, which left Tamiya completely flushed and speechless. Shortly after, Natsuki was already comfortably settled on the cushion, reading, while Tamiya remained on the beanbag chair, also with his book. He observed her, hoping that she was at least a little comfortable with the new arrangement. However, something still worried him. With that, it became increasingly difficult to think about how to push her away from his refuge. He felt confused, questioning himself if his thoughts and actions weren't contradicting themselves, because now he didn't even know anymore what he really wanted to do. Meanwhile, Natsuki seemed quite satisfied and comfortable on the new cushion. A slight smile escaped her lips, which left our hero a bit more at ease. However, he thought to himself that she didn't need to show so much happiness. Later, already in the classroom, Tamiya found himself pensive at his desk, looking at nothing. One of his friends, Oka, approached and asked why he was so distracted, and commented that he looked like a maiden in love, stating that it was disgusting, making Tamiya stammer in denial, stating that he wasn't in love. At that moment, another friend, Sonoya, called him and reminded him that they had an important task to do. She explained they needed to help prepare the room for the next class. However, Sonoya approached curiously, asking what the conversation was about, and Oka soon replied that they were talking about Tamiya being in love, while he, once again, denied it, visibly flustered. Our hero then suggested they go to the teacher's lounge. As they walked down the hallway, Sonoya asked again who Tamiya was in love with, and he, already tired of the insistence, said she was very persistent. He then stated that he wasn't in love and that in truth, there was something bothering him. Suddenly, upon turning a corner, he spotted a group of girls, and among them, there was Natsuki, with her imposing presence and her immense melons. With that, Tamiya's heart raced, and he became completely flushed. Quickly, he tried to move away, and he passed before his beloved without even looking at her face. But upon noticing she hadn't shown any reaction, he became somewhat confused. However, he let out a sigh, relieved at not having been noticed. At the same time, Sonoya stared at him with suspicion, and to his complete astonishment, she concluded that the target of his love was Natsuki. Tamiya vehemently denied it, stammering in despair, while Sonoya observed that he was excessively agitated. He then tried to explain himself, saying she was completely mistaken and that she shouldn't jump to conclusions, stating that Natsuki was far above him and that they lived in different worlds. The poor guy then confessed that lately she had been frequenting his club room, explaining that he was racking his brain trying to find a way to deal with the situation. Sonoya, however, didn't seem convinced and stated that she felt sorry for him, as it seemed he could no longer distinguish fantasy from reality. Shortly after, as they walked down the hallway, Sonoya advised him to be careful so the situation wouldn't worsen and he would end up becoming a stalker. Later, back in the club room, Natsuki was sitting on the cushion, using her cell phone, while Tamiya remained on the beanbag chair. Suddenly, the girl turned towards him, asking if they hadn't crossed paths in the hallway earlier that day, which left the poor guy visibly surprised. She then asked if he hadn't noticed her, and he, awkwardly, just apologized. With a slight smile, she explained that she had seen him, but was in doubt whether she should call him, and while thinking about it, they ended up crossing paths quickly. Tamiya just said he understood, feeling internally grateful that she hadn't approached him at that moment. Soon, a brief silence settled in the room. Then, Natsuki called him again, and a bit nervous, she started to stammer. With a flushed face, she asked if the girl who was with him earlier was his girlfriend, and before he could answer, she added that if that were the case, it wouldn't be good for her to continue frequenting the club every day, which left Tamiya surprised by her consideration. He then quickly clarified that Sonoya was just a classmate, a friend, a gaming partner, an otaku. And with an awkward smile, he commented that there was no chance any girl would want to be his girlfriend, not even for a second, which left Natsuki surprised. Tamiya then looked away, thinking to himself that he had said something unnecessary. But to his surprise, the girl seemed relieved and with a radiant smile stated that was great. She then enthusiastically concluded that that being the case, she could call him even when they weren't in the club room, leaving our hero even more surprised and a little uncomfortable with the idea. Approaching, she said he should also feel free to greet her if he saw her. With a smile, Natsuki got even even closer, leaving the poor guy stammering non-stop. Suddenly, her eyes began to shine, and leaning over him, she instructed him to keep the arrangement, and with her immense melons on him, she questioned if he had understood. Completely intimidated by Natsuki's approach, Tamiya could only stammer that he had understood. Soon, she took a step back and started to celebrate. He then thought to himself that he had felt an enormous intimidation coming from her, and that she seemed even bigger than normal. Meanwhile, Natsuki flexed her immense muscles, staying with her hands on her waist. And well, time for a break from studying. With that, our hero poured some coffee into his cup and took a sip. And then he went to the window, letting out a long sigh. He stated that having a cup of coffee in the morning on a day off in the club room was the best thing in the world. Still, that was the first time he had done something like that. And, well, the crazy guy was at school on a day off for no apparent reason, just to get a notebook he had forgotten. Suddenly, the physical education teacher's scream echoed in the environment, telling them to try harder. From the window, he saw Natsuki and the other girls from the athletics club running on the track. She ran with determination and, of course, shaking her big melons in the process. The girls passed in front of the school building, and from the clubroom window, Tamiya watched them. He commented, surprised, that they were training even on a day off, and he was impressed by their dedication, doubting he could do that. Turning into the room, he sighed, reaffirming to himself that they really lived in different worlds. He then took another sip of his coffee, lost in thought, and a long sigh escaped his lips. At that instant, he heard someone shout Natsuki's name outside. The blonde girl from the athletics club with a clipboard in her hand asked, irritated, where Natsuki had gone, while another colleague commented that she had simply escaped. Irritated, the girl yelled that she was skipping practice again. At the same time, our hero wondered where Natsuki went on days like that. Suddenly, she called him, making him spit out his coffee at the same time. Soon, Natsuki apologized for catching him by surprise. With a smile, she asked why he was there and explained that, while running, she had seen his silhouette. Embarrassed, Tamiya thought to himself that he shouldn't have acted so carelessly near the window. The girl then asked if he went to the clubroom even on days off, and he, awkwardly, replied that going there that day had just been a coincidence. Then, she gave him a perverted smile. Soon she sighed, complaining that she hated having to sweat so much early in the morning. Natsuki then grabbed a package of wet wipes and started cleaning herself. While grumbling, she raised her arms and wiped her armpits, completely at ease in front of Tamiya, which left our hero completely uncomfortable, thinking that that kind of thing should be done in the locker room and not there in front of him. Soon he wondered if she saw him as a man or just as a harmless insect. Natsuki then finished cleaning herself, feeling refreshed. Then she threw the used wipes in the trash, which made our hero observe her and look with a face of disgust at the trash. Realizing that his place of peace had been violated again, Natsuki, noticing his look, asked what was wrong. He then quickly denied having done anything, stating that those wipes were just trash, and relieved, he thought he had narrowly escaped, as the doors to a strange fetish were about to open. Trying to change the subject, he asked if she would like a cup of coffee, which left the girl surprised. Tamiya then began to fill her cup, and the girl accepted with enthusiasm. While our hero drank his coffee near the window, Natsuki settled on the cushion. Suddenly, the girl asked for his contact, which surprised him. She then explained that she had realized that after so long, they still hadn't exchanged contacts. The young man, feeling a little lighter, agreed to exchange contacts, stating that perhaps that was a kind of truce on a sunny day. Natsuki, however, explained that she didn't have her cell phone at the moment and asked him to do it later. She then said goodbye, saying that she would finish training at noon, and asked him to wait for her at the gate, which left our protagonist sad for having to wait 2 more hours. And so 2 hours later, Tamiya was at the school gate, waiting for her. Soon she appeared, thanking him for waiting. The girl had already changed clothes and was wearing a white t-shirt and sweatpants. She then showed him her cell phone, explaining that that was her ID. And upon adding her, a message soon appeared from the girl asking which direction his house was in. A little surprised by the question, he didn't know what to answer. He then showed the direction, however, stated that he would take a train. With a smile, she looked at the cell phone and suggested they go to the station together, which left Tamiya flushed and speechless. And with nowhere to run, he just confirmed. And so the two walked together. Meanwhile, our hero thought internally that that was the dense smell of adolescence. Sometime later, back in the clubroom, once again, Natsuki invaded his space, sitting on his cushion and reading a book, while Tamiya, lying on the beanbag chair, was using his cell phone. He then stated that finally he was getting used to her presence. A yawn escaped his lips, but suddenly his eyes turned to the side. It was Natsuki who was leaning over him. Surprised, he stammered, and she, holding a manga, asked where the next volume of that series was. Promptly, he got up and grabbed the volume from the shelf, handing it to her, who thanked him. While the girl went back to reading, Tamiya changed his mind and thought to himself that he was wrong, as he still wasn't even a little used to her presence. He reflected that if he couldn't keep calm, he would be lost every time she did something. Then, he concluded that he needed to increase his level of resistance, even if he had to force himself to do so. Natsuki, noticing his restlessness, turned. She then asked what was wrong, and he, awkwardly, just replied that nothing was, and with a serious expression, asked her not to mind him, even if she noticed that he was staring at her a little too much. The girl with a flushed face and wide eyes became visibly confused. He then stated that the first step of his training would be to observe her closely and explained that for him, one of the most important requirements was to get used to seeing her. Thus, while Natsuki read her book, Tamiya stared at her fixedly, trying to put his plan into practice. The girl, feeling his persistent gaze, began to look at him, a little annoyed. He, however, continued to observe her, frightening determination. Suddenly, Natsuki stood up, flexing her muscular legs, which made our protagonist's eyes widen with her sudden movement. She then approached and stopped right in front of him, with her hands behind her back, and closing her face, she commented that if he was so interested in looking, then come closer at once, which left him completely shocked. Natsuki then approached him with a sadistic smile, causing Tamiya's face to be glued to the defined muscles of her abdomen. Completely surprised and flushed, he started to stammer non-stop. His eyes rolled as he called her name in desperation. Sweat ran down his face and his eyes widened in pure panic. Suddenly, he found himself lying down, panting and with his heart racing. The girl then leaned over him and with a smile wished him good morning. Confused, Tamiya asked if he had fallen asleep and she confirmed, yes, in the end, it was all a dream. But even so, it bothered him because he realized she was starting to take up too much space even in his thoughts. The girl watched him, confused, and with a flushed face, she asked what kind of dream he had had. However, she stammered and asked him not to tell. Natsuki then said goodbye, saying that she needed to go back to the club and left in a hurry. Tamiya watched her, noticing that she seemed a little agitated. Suddenly, he looked down and he realized, completely embarrassed, what had really happened. His tent was up. With his face completely red, he knelt while covering himself with his hands. Meanwhile, Natsuki ran away, completely embarrassed, trying to convince herself that that was just a normal physiological phenomenon. Later after school, our hero found himself in a bookstore. He walked through the corridors looking for something to read, maybe something healthy, and wondered if he would find any interesting manga there. Suddenly, his eyes widened as he saw something on the shelf. He approached, and among the manga, one in particular caught his attention. The cover showed an athletic girl with a sculptural body, strangely familiar. Tamiya looked at it with disdain and grumbled that he was already tired of those mangas that only caught attention for the cover and not for the content. He picked up the copy called Maidens of Athletics and, confused, wondered what kind of thing that was, thinking that it didn't make sense since no athlete would have such large breasts because that would only hinder the running. While walking through the store, he thought that even though it was fiction, the author should have a little more contact with reality. He then went to the cashier, where a clerk was waiting for him, and placing the manga on the counter, he said he would like to take that one. With an awkward smile, he tried to justify himself, thinking that it wasn't good to judge before reading, and that therefore he should at least buy it first. Suddenly, a cold sweat ran down his face, and the clerk, who to his complete astonishment was Sonoya, held the manga and read the title aloud, Maidens of Athletics. Our hero, completely embarrassed, thought that his fetish was completely exposed to her. He then, stammering, called her, surprised to find her there, while Sonoya just greeted him. Tamiya, still incredulous, asked if she was working there part-time, and she confirmed, explaining that it had been a week. Desperate, he tried to grab the manga back, stating that that was a big misunderstanding. While she just asked what he was talking about, Sonoya teased him, asking if he hadn't bought that manga because it was exactly the kind of thing he dreamed of, and Tamiya, seized by panic, denied, claiming that he only wanted a volume of One Piece, while trying to understand how that other manga had ended up in his hands. The friend, with a serious look, told him not to worry, stating that everyone had their preferences. She reassured him, stating that she would never laugh at him. Soon, silence took over the place, making everything more uncomfortable. Then, Sonoya began to hold back her laughter, puffing out her cheeks, which made him yell at her. She then, hugging the manga against her chest, concluded that he was thinking of Natsuki when he picked that up, and stated that she couldn't help but see him as a good example of a virgin. Furious, our hero asked to speak to the manager, demanding that Sonoya be fired immediately, but she calmly replied that the manager wasn't there at the moment. The machine then displayed the value of 790 yen on the screen, and while the poor guy was leaving the bookstore, Sonoya thanked him for his preference. Soon he walked down the street, still a little dazed by what had happened. He looked at the cover, trying to convince himself that he hadn't grabbed the manga just because he had seen a glimpse of Natsuki in the character, and grumbled to himself, saying that he shouldn't mix fiction with reality, stating that, in the first place, that character didn't even look so much like his beloved. And suddenly he stopped in front of the said one and her red-haired friend. Natsuki, with a smile, greeted him, which left him completely surprised and scared. She then commented that she was going to karaoke with a friend, and Tamiya, already with the manga hidden behind his pants, just thought that was a big coincidence. The girl then asked about him, and he, nervous, replied that he had just left the bookstore. Curious, she asked which book he had bought, which made him even more awkward. With that, he tried to change the subject, stating it wasn't a big deal, just a healthy book. Quickly, the poor guy said goodbye, saying he needed to go and ran off. Natsuki and her friend watched him walk away, confused by his reaction. Natsuki's friend asked if that was someone she knew, and Natsuki confirmed, saying it was Tamiya from the literature club. Soon she asked what was wrong, and Fumin, noticing something, just said that it wasn't. However, she remembered having seen the cover of the manga Maidens of Athletics in his hands, and the way he tried to hide the manga and his behavior in front of Shiho, Fumin was absolutely certain that Tamiya was a worm trying to get close to her friend. Natsuki, noticing her friend's